Difficult times create strong individuals, and even more challenging times demand heroes to inspire nations. 13th century Scotland was undergoing such difficult times. King Alexander, who had long ruled the country with peace and prosperity, had died, and the ensuing succession crisis resulted in the invasion of the English. Conditions worsened rapidly as the Scottish people faced the harsh treatment of the invaders. English arrogance and violence were felt throughout the country, making it difficult for the local population to meet even their basic needs. However, the storm changed direction quickly. A man named William Wallace, with a few supporters around him, began to dismantle the south of Scotland with the blood of the invaders. Wallace provided the Scottish people with what they needed, the spirit of independence, laying the foundation for their struggles. Nevertheless, his epic story ultimately ended, tainted with betrayal, death, torture, and bloodshed. However, like his life, actions, and thoughts, his death also turned into a symbol of Scotland's independence. The small spark ignited by William would soon turn into a massive ring of fire engulfing all of North Britain. The early years of William Wallace's story, shrouded in the misty darkness of the Middle Ages, what is known about his family is quite limited. According to various sources, his father's name was Malcolm or Alan. His birthplace is recorded either near Glasgow in Elderslie or in a different settlement in Ayrshire further south. Nevertheless, behind this misty image, it is possible to trace a vague story depicting Wallace's early years. As understood from the lines of Blind Harry, the Scottish minstrel, William came from a noble but economically struggling family. He was born around 1270 and spent his early years repeating the basic religious teachings and learning how to fight with his brothers named Malcolm or John. Most of his education took place near Stirling in the town of Dunipace, under the supervision of his uncle, a priest. In a few years, he could transform into the pious and brave man his family had dreamed of. The years when William grew up coincided with a long period of peace and economic stability under the rule of Scotland's King Alexander III. However, shortly after 1272, when Edward I ascended to the throne of England, claiming his right to the Scottish throne, the good fortune of Scotland would not last. William's early years, during which he shaped his future life, took place in a time of long-term peace and economic stability under the rule of King III, Alexander of Scotland. However, shortly after William's birth, in 1272, Edward I, who ascended to the throne of England, claimed his right to the Scottish throne, but this attempt did not have much influence on King Alexander. However, the reversal of Scotland's good luck would not take long. The first event in the series of events that would shape William's future life was about to take place in Kinghorn, located on the east coast of Scotland. On March 19, 1286, King Alexander set out on a journey near this town. Soon, a relentless storm covering the slopes and cliffs in the area caused a tragic event that would forever change the fate of William and Scotland. Due to heavy rain and strong winds, King Alexander lost control of his horse. Everything happened in an instant, and in the blink of an eye, the king and his horse disappeared. Within a few days, his lifeless body was found on one of the cliffs in the vicinity. Following Alexander's death, the Guardians, a government called to protect Scotland, gathered to initiate the necessary procedures for succession. Since the late king had no surviving male heir, Margaret, the late king's daughter in Norway, was elected Queen of Scotland. However, until her arrival in the country, the government assumed control of the kingdom. But this journey marked the beginning of the end for Margaret. Fate did not allow her to set foot in Great Britain. The new queen fell ill and passed away towards the end of September in the Orkney Islands in the north of Scotland in the year 1290. The series of calamities that began with Alexander's death was far from over. The absence of a clear heir from the former king's lineage led to 13 different claimants asserting their right to the throne. The most prominent among them were John Balliol and Robert Bruce, both descended from the former Duke of Huntingdon. David, the growing polarization of power, increasing calls for civil war, and the panic induced by the uncertainty after Alexander's death eventually led the protective government to invite King Edward I of England, a mediator, to Scotland. However, this endeavor turned out to be one of the greatest mistakes in Scottish history. King Edward arrived with a massive English army on the Scottish border soon after the invitation. With a well-equipped army, he resembled more of a greedy invader than a moderate mediator. However, his army was there not to fight, but to intimidate. Eventually, after a brief preparation, in early November of 1292, Edward met with Scottish representatives in Berwick Castle on the banks of the River Tweed, located on the Scottish border. The negotiations generally progressed as Edward desired. All candidates acknowledged him as the Supreme Lord of Scotland. The choice was not difficult, as John Balliol was the most deserving candidate based on bloodline, and all Edward had to do was crown him as the King of Scotland. However, this crown meant little to him. From this moment on, Edward began taking steps to gradually weaken John's authority. He viewed Scotland as a feudal vassal state, demanding respect and military support for his war against France. These new developments eventually exhausted the patience of Scottish aristocrats. In July 1295, the Protective Council gathered and sidelined John, reclaiming control of the country. The government immediately severed communication with the English, signing a mutual alliance agreement with France based on military cooperation. However, this new situation would soon turn the gathering storm clouds over Scotland into a relentless tempest. In retaliation for the Scots' agreement with the French, Edward directed his army northward and attacked Berwick on the Tweed River border, occupying the town. Although the Scots initially resisted at Dunbar, they suffered a heavy defeat on April 27, 1296, and were forced to withdraw. Following this, Edward seized the Stone of Destiny, symbolizing power in Scotland, and dethroned John Balliol, imprisoning him in the Tower of London. From this moment on, everything began to change for the Scots. Soon, the north of the island was overflowing with English soldiers and officials. Edward brought the English administrative system to Scotland to establish his dominance. The English victory in Dunbar was decisive, and Edward's campaign was successful. However, this success would not be permanent. In these years, not only was Scotland invaded by the English, but it was also surrounded by internal conflicts. Some Scottish nobles did not acknowledge Edward's rule. Meanwhile, English forces freely moved in their camps and fortified garrisons in Scotland. Civilian life was under threat, and the harassments of the invaders towards the ordinary people were becoming more widespread day by day. Additionally, some Scottish nobles did very little to maintain the rule of law and protect the Scots from English oppression. In this lawlessness and panic, William Wallace's father was killed in a conflict with English forces. This event undoubtedly contributed to Wallace's desire to fight for his nation's independence throughout his life. Nevertheless, during these years, William was living as an outlaw, constantly on the move to escape the English and occasionally facing them in wild confrontations. All these indicators suggest that William was personally engaged in a struggle against the English during this period. The first event in which we know he participated is a skirmish involving the killing of the appointed sheriff of Lanark by Wallace. While some sources attribute the cause of this skirmish to the death of William Wallace's wife, Marion Braveheart, the reasons and timing of her death are unclear. Following this event, William Wallace was officially declared an outlaw, and a warrant was issued for his arrest, urging anyone to capture him on sight. In 1297, Wallace joined forces with Lord William Douglas, a Scottish noble who did not recognize Edward's rule, and together they began raiding English camps. In a short time, this movement turned into a major rebellion. However, the English sensed trouble in the air. Around July, they gathered all the nobles in southern Scotland in the town of Irvine to show their strength and brought them all under their control. However, William Wallace and his close friend Andrew Murray, who would stand shoulder to shoulder in the battle at Stirling, did not attend the meeting. They were determined to continue their resistance. During this period, Wallace began using the Ettrick Forest near the England-Scotland border as a base for his raiding incursions into English territories. Meanwhile, Murray captured English-controlled castles such as Urquhart, Inverness, Elgin, Banff, and Aberdeen. Soon, Wallace decided that a more serious effort was needed. In the late summer of 1297, Andrew Murray and his forces joined him, and in early September, the duo moved to siege Dundee, a town traditionally considered the key to Scotland by the English, on the River Forth. However, the English had received word of this attempt. Thus, the English forces under the leadership of Earl John Warren also reached the other side of the river on September 9, 1297. Nevertheless, the number of supporters around Wallace was growing every day. Some English sources claim that Earl John was astonished by the number of Scots he encountered at Stirling. However, it is essential to note that English historians exhibited a clear bias when it came to the Scottish War of Independence. Some sources even mentioned that the English did not find the sight surprising, but viewed them as easily crushable mice. Nevertheless, modern sources have suggested that the well-equipped English army had a presence ranging from approximately 15,000 to 45,000, while the Scottish army did not exceed 15,000. On the morning of September 11th, when the battle commenced, the English, accompanied by Welsh archers, crossed the narrow and old Stirling Bridge and awaited orders to attack. The Scots were positioned on the slope near the river to retain their advantageous position, expecting the English to initiate the attack. However, in the midst of this tense waiting, a strange event occurred. The English infantry and Welsh archers were called back to the other side of the river. Earl John Warren had fallen asleep and wanted to give the order to cross the river himself. Finally, his request was fulfilled. John gave the order, and the English began crossing the bridge again. However, the Scots had no intention of waiting in this tense anticipation. Before nearly 5,000 English soldiers had crossed the bridge, Wallace and the Scots swiftly descended to the river bank and launched a fierce attack. The English, confused by the war cries of the opposing side, began piling up on the bridge in a momentary panic. However, the old bridge could not withstand such a weight. Soon, a loud noise was heard, and Stirling Bridge sank into the calm waters of the Forth River. On the north side of the river, the English under the command of Hugh de Cressingham were defeated by the Scots, who were filled with anger and hatred. English commander John Warren watched the killing of Hugh and his infantry from the other side of the river, and eventually realizing he had lost the battle, he ordered his soldiers to retreat towards Berwick. On the Scottish side, Andrew Murray had died during the battle due to severe injuries. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was crucial for both Scotland and William. Scotland's fight for independence had officially begun, and the English, thought to be invincible, suffered a defeat. Soon after, representatives of Edward had to seek peace from William Wallace. However, he had no intention of stopping what he had started. Therefore, he insulted the representatives, rejected the peace offer, and advanced to northern England, capturing the city of York. He now held the title bestowed upon him by Robert Bruce, the Guardian Knight of Scotland, and the stories told about him were starting to turn into legends. Within a few months, he had become one of the most recognized and talked about political figures in Britain. Wallace, after his success at Stirling, seized important earldoms like Northumberland and Cumberland in northern England. However, he could not gain the full support of Scottish nobles. They were still enemies among the aristocrats. On the other hand, the Scottish people had embraced the spirit of independence under Wallace. The fuse for a struggle for independence against the rule of a foreign kingdom had been lit. At this very moment, with Edward returning to the island from a campaign in France, the winds began to change. King Edward, taking command of his army, headed north to confront the Scots under the leadership of Wallace. It should be noted that some sources exaggerate the number of warriors supporting him when he entered Scotland, claiming his army, supported by Gallic warriors, reached about 90,000, the modest Scottish army under Wallace's command, however, was estimated to be no more than 15,000. Wallace retreated with his army to Falkirk, northwest of Edinburgh, to maintain a defensive position. The fate of Scotland would be determined here. While some Scottish nobles sided with Wallace, a portion of them was quite reluctant to fight the English. After pillaging Lothian and reclaiming a few castles, the English approached Falkirk to engage in open combat. When the initial clashes began, Scottish soldiers with long spears managed to gain the upper hand against the English infantry. However, the course of the battle began to change with the involvement of numerous archers, mainly from Wales. The Scottish lines quickly disintegrated. Some Scottish nobles, like John Graham, were cut down under English swords. Approximately 10,000 Scots lay lifeless on the battlefield. William Wallace had few options left. Choosing not to lose his military reputation completely, he left the battlefield. The complete withdrawal of the Scottish army followed. Finally, around the evening of July 22, 1298, the English victory became certain. This undoubtedly marked a downfall in William's career. After abandoning the title of Guardian Knight of Scotland, given to him by Robert Bruce, in favor of John Comyn, Wallace withdrew into the depths of the dark forests of Scotland. Wallace's activities during the period from 1299 to 1303 are uncertain. Some sources suggest that he went to France to seek support from King Philip IV. According to these sources, the King of France, along with the Pope and the King of Norway, provided various forms of assistance to him. The French envoy, who reached Rome on November 7, 1300, carried a petition to the Pope containing William's requests. However, the peace treaty between France and England in 1303 seriously disrupted this process. This agreement also provided an opportunity for Edward to launch a new invasion of Scotland. In 1304, the English reclaimed Stirling. In the same year, Wallace returned to Scotland and participated in conflicts at Hapru and Erneside. However, the English advance could not be stopped. Eventually, many Scottish nobles submitted to Edward, renewing their allegiance. Yet, none of this was sufficient. The English wanted to send a bloody message to the Scottish people, and a secret plan was devised shortly. Finally, on August 5, 1305, a loyal Scottish noble to Edward, John Menteith, collaborated with English commander John Sagravi to ambush Wallace near Glasgow. Ultimately, William Wallace, the man who ignited the spark of Scotland's independence war, was captured, chained, and brought to London for trial. During the interrogations at Westminster Palace, when asked why he betrayed King Edward of England, he replied, "I did not betray Edward because I was never his subject." However, when the judges looked at him, they saw no less than a traitor thirsty for English blood. Following the trial, Wallace was taken to the Tower of London, a popular location for the trial of those accused of betraying England. After spending a few hours there, he was stripped of his clothes, tied to the back of a horse, and dragged to Elm Street in Smithfield. William was entrusted to skilled executioners. Moreover, hundreds of people who wanted to witness his death were quite pleased to turn this into a spectacle. First, a thick rope was tightened around his throat. However, before his breath was cut off, the rope was loosened. William Wallace's death had to leave a lasting impact on people's minds and hearts. Every moment of the execution had to be impressive. The English had felt humiliated while fighting him, so William had to be humiliated. Therefore, before his body received a mortal wound, he was castrated. Afterward, his intestines were removed, and, while still alive, he was burned before the eyes of the onlookers. His head was then severed and hung on the Tower of London. Soon, the heads of the Fraser brothers, John and Simon, would accompany his body was divided into 4 parts. Each limb was displayed in border regions like Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. The English had finally delivered the bloody message they intended. However, just as in his life, William Wallace continued to inspire the Scottish people even in death. In 1306, Robert Bruce, who became the King of Scotland, revived the national struggle for independence initiated by Wallace. If Edward set out to respond to him, he fell ill and died near Carlisle. In the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the English suffered one of the greatest defeats in history. Victorious Robert declared Scotland's independence. However, this independence was never recognized by the English. The story of William Wallace, his life, deeds, and death continued to inspire the Scottish people for generations. In 1869, a statue was erected near Stirling in his honor. On April 8, 1956, a metal plaque was placed near Smithfield, where he was executed, with the inscription, "I tell you the truth. Freedom is best, sons. Never live life as a slave."